Professor Marcantonio Spada, he was saying that some people are locked in that mode and they're not able to get out of it anymore. You were conned by a big pharma and its corporate capture on government, and you allowed someone to inject yourself with the most toxic so-called vaccine that was ever been done. Nobody wants to hear that. It takes quite a lot to, at some stage, think, oh my God, actually, maybe everything I've done was based on something which wasn't true.
Well, welcome, Robin, to our studio. It's fantastic to have you. The reason I asked you to come was because I'd seen a couple of your interviews. You've been on my radar a little bit through, I saw you at Jam for Freedom, and then I was following you on Instagram, and then I watched a few of your interviews, and I just thought, what a great conversation one could have with this man. So, because you seem to, I'd say well, for me, I mean, you might see it differently, but you're quite a broad spectrum. You know, someone asked, well, what does Robin do, or what's that? So I'll ask you in a minute to maybe say how you would answer that question. Yeah, I know you've directed a film with Charles Dance. Is that right?
Produced
film,
yeah.
Sorry. I know you're interested in natural health and the whole wider issues of freedom. So welcome and thanks for coming to sit for a portrait.
Thank you for having me. It's quite unique experience. Never had it before, so interesting to participate in it. And also I saw when you contacted me, I had a look on Instagram, and I like the way you do them. Yeah, I like your approach to them, and the fact that if we talk about the difference between the analog and the digital, they're clearly painters' portraits. They're not. Sure. They're not trying to be a photograph. Which I think I like, because otherwise might as well get a photo if that's what you want.
Of course,
And especially now, since the lockdown, with the division between everything becoming digital, including human interactions, where the physical is sort of dropped, and there's always these Zoom. Every time there's a request for a Zoom, I understand why I should accept them because no one's traveling. But I've always got a sense like, I don't really want to be doing this. I don't really want to go on a screen. I sort of still kind of quite hesitant. And actually one of the things, to partially answer your question, one of the things that I was doing a while back now was teaching architectural design at university.
Didn't mention that,
And the whole thing of our unit, our work group, our whole philosophy was to get students to work physically, so to make physical models, even if they're rough with cardboard and masking tape, just to get them to do things and to not put everything behind a screen, so to come out, to make things, to draw, to sketch by hand, even some photography, but the whole point was we could see already. I mean, since I started studying architecture a long time ago, I saw it all happening. I mean, when I went to architecture school, there were workshops, were sort of the engine room, like wood workshops, metal workshops, dark rooms. There was all that world, and people doing all these kind of quite inspirational models and sculptural things, or amazing photographs. And then I saw it all come in. Then the computer room starts to become bigger and bigger and bigger, and then the sort of the drawings become more and more removed from anything physical, because it's a mouse and a screen. The scale what happens with students is they lose the sense of scale. So things are either too big or too small. In a computer, it's very difficult to, unless you always have humans in it, it's always very difficult to tell. And then we saw, coming mainly from America, a whole school which was totally based on using the software to design buildings. So buildings ended up becoming what the software allowed them to be. So there wasn't a sense of like, I want this because, whatever reason. It's almost like the software allows it, so we're going to make things look like this. which is fine. I'm not against it, and the people who are teaching, I consider them my friends. But we wanted to hold on to something different because we were brought up under a different tradition and under a different way of doing things, to the sense that when I was doing my sort of practice in architectural studios, we were, the shading, which is done in drawings by lines, like you use lines to do shades.
Cross-hatching.
Cross-hatching.
Yeah.
So, I used to do that with a little device that used to press a button and it would just move those like millimeters to then do a line. So all of that hatching was done by hand.
Yeah.
And the model, we would just make models by hand and glue and Stanley knife and all that.
There's a kind of magic that happens when you interact with the physical world that doesn't happen when you interact digitally, I think.
Yeah.
That you can't even put into words or even maybe understand before it happens.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Yeah. So, coming back to that kind of loop of that's what we stood for as a group. And then we went into wood models, and those were quite beautiful because they also, you could use cedar wood, they would smell like wood.
Oh, yeah.
So it becomes a whole sensorial world, which otherwise is totally not there. And in some ways, I guess I still see myself a little bit like that person. And so I kind of saw some of that in the portrait, although I haven't seen one of them physically yet. I saw them through Instagram.
Yeah, sure.
And as you know, I do use social media, probably too much for my own good. But so I don't, I don't sort of not Amish or, I don't sort of reject technology, but I still see myself as standing for the physical world, which I also saw in your portraits.
Yeah.
And I kind of like that. And I'm very happy to be participating
excellent.
in this. And I thought the concept also was very interesting. I know Vicky came up with it, but it's a very interesting idea to sort of sit and talk, and then there's a portrait that's happening, there's a camera on the portrait, on me, on you, there's a whole thing going on. It's not just two people talking, which is fine, but there's this whole other dimension which I've never seen before. I don't know if, have you ever seen it before? I mean, I haven't, sounds relatively unique.
Apparently there's someone in Australia that did a similar thing. I've not seen it.
Yeah, so the physical, and also when it comes to humans, there's a totally different thing. So at some stage, some local people who were all on the same page, I sort of started organizing a physical meeting because you start to get fooled that you're getting your human contact through the digital devices, and you're not. It's not what you need emotionally as a body, as an embodied being in the world. It's not what you need.
Yeah.
And there's the illusion that it may be what you need, and that's what they're banking on. But it doesn't satisfy that, and it doesn't do, as you said, it doesn't do what the physical meetings of two bodies and two beings can experience.
Yeah. We've found that in our sort of local community. So there's an online community through Telegram where there's probably about 300 or 400 members of the sort of Brighton group. And
is it linked to the Stand in the Park or not?
No, it was sort of before Stand in the Park in a way. It began right at the start with a couple of friends, and it's just grown. So what we found during lockdown was probably only 10% of that number would come out to the physical meetups.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and I think I understand that people have difficulties interacting socially. We all have our hang-ups and our difficulties. But I think that's part of this whole movement is coming to terms with those and trying to overcome those difficulties that we have. So I look at that whole COVID era as a training ground, as a gift. And I think that was one of the gifts. It was to help people come out and interact physically with one another and create community. And that's really where the future is for me, and where we need to be heading.
Yeah, I mean, I remember going out to a bar just when they reopened, how scared I felt with all these people around. Wasn't used to it anymore.
Right.
So I can understand the anxiety that was there at the time, but by now we should have kind of overcome with. But then again, that's what my friend who coined the term COVID anxiety syndrome was saying. So Professor Marcantonio Spada, he was saying that some people are locked in that mode and they're not able to get out of it anymore.
Yeah.
Or at least were. I don't know. Some people may still be. I guess when you see people wearing masks so obsessively, they're probably still locked in. And
yeah.
So in some ways, some of us managed to get out. Some people are probably still hiding at home for fear of the seasonal virus.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. So you say you struggled a little bit reintegrating.
Well, I remember how I felt with all these people around.
Yeah.
And, I can understand the comfort of being sort of in a room somewhere with a screen and then kind of, expressing things and communicating, and the difference that it is to do that physically in the same room, because there are all sorts of different emotional things happen which do not happen when you're in front of a screen. And part of it is being yourself there, present, and actually scanning these things and saying it's okay. It's okay that I'm a physical creature. It's okay that I may go through a wider range of emotions when I show up physically to something.
Yeah.
I mean, what was it that Woody Allen said? He said something like 90% of everything in life is just showing up. And that's the thing. There's always that sense, I'm just not going to go. I'm not going to do it. But, ultimately, that's why I always remind myself of Woody Allen. I think that's kind of true. Well, you just show up, and then whatever happens, and you just deal with it. But if you don't show up, nothing happens.
Yeah. Yeah, I've not heard that one. But as a father of an 11-year-old, that's in the toolbox now.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense to me. We're all full of some kind of anxiety and fear. Maybe not full, the wrong word, but we have to deal with our own anxieties, and COVID accentuated that for a lot of people.
And maybe especially if you are, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you are an artistic person by nature, so you've gone into the arts, whether it's painting or music or video or even architecture or something like that. Generally there's quite someone who's sort of has got quite an emotional range, let's say, that goes on, that it can get expressed through those mediums.
I would say that everyone has that emotional range. I think those who maybe are expressing or trying to express that through some artistic form or whatever, they're not necessarily more intense. They don't necessarily feel it more intensely. They just somehow have a bit like that you've said. They've turned up.
They've turned up. Yeah.
They've turned up. All right. I want to deal with this. They're not stuck in the suppression mode so much as perhaps the average person. Yeah. But I know from my own experience that those who may appear shut down, numb, emotionally cold, if you scratch the surface, there's more than there's just the same amount of pain, anguish, perhaps even more. Perhaps that's why they're needing to sort of shut down to some extent.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, that you sort of sometimes choose not to show up for yourself because you may be afraid of that emotional range.
Yeah.
And maybe if you choose to express it directly, you may be more gung-ho about it and say, I'm just going to express it. And you're not as, let's say, as fearful to deal with it, or maybe it's not as painful for you as it may be for someone else, so you're able to do that.
Yeah. And I suppose it's, carrying the metaphor forward, when you do show up, it becomes easier every time. So I suppose those people who just get to practice that a little bit realise it's not as scary as maybe they thought, and therefore they carry on down that road of sort of expressing.
Yeah, it can get scary. I remember the first time I gave a presentation, because how it worked in architecture school is that you'd give a presentation to the whole crop of new students.
Okay.
And you'd say, this is what we're going to do. And then they would kind of choose you. And I think I remember the first time facing like all an audience of eyes looking at you and kind of expecting of you and sort of deciding whether they would want to work with you. I remember how it felt. And then I remember how it felt the last time I did it, felt absolutely fine. You went into a particular zone where you just show up in that zone and it just happens. And yes, there is still a bit of an emotional feeling about facing a huge, relatively big crowd looking at you intently, but you get used to it. But at the beginning, it almost feels like, it's kind of, you get sort of palpitations and you start thinking, maybe I can't do it, but then you can. So everything you sort of get used to it. And that's what, in a way, the digital world is able to give you a choice to avoid a lot of that. And therefore, if you don't constantly bridge the two, it may get more difficult to do things in another way.
You get stuck.
And then there's the phenomenon of the anger that's expressed digitally that people would never express in person, because they would just sense that there's another human being, which, whatever their disagreements or different views, is a human. But then behind the screen, people can get very angry and we can sort of start insulting people for different opinions, and the whole cancel culture, in a way, is a child of this digital existence.
Yeah, I think we've all experienced that, haven't we? Everyone, if they're interacting online with people, they've experienced that. It's so common, and been guilty of it myself to some extent. I'm
it's easily
really
done.
Conscious of it now, so I make a real conscious effort to communicate as if that person is with me. It's not always easy to do. You get annoyed, you get irritated, and but I think it's important that we do always bear that in mind, that it's a human being that we're interacting with. And in fact, we've had quite a few conflicts in the group with people who I know they wouldn't interact like that in person. And yet they fall out and it creates division. So that's another part of learning to be human and interact in a positive way, I think.
Do you find that it becomes easier to not lose it digitally? I remember at the very beginning, or maybe it's because I used to be on Facebook and I've left it a few years ago. But I remember at the very beginning how easy it was to get involved in some kind of online argument.
Yeah.
And now I think, I can fall for it occasionally, but generally I'm able to just not go there.
Yeah.
And probably because I've been through it.
Yeah.
And I know that it doesn't bring anything good, and so just sort of I don't have this sense that I need to be there, proving to someone I don't know something that I believe in.
Exactly, yeah.
Also, maybe by experience you learn it doesn't work like that anyway, so no one gets convinced about anything generally in that way. So
that's more to the point. I would agree 100% with what you just said. because the two go hand in hand. You realise, one, that it doesn't get anywhere. Well, it's unproductive.
And one example, which is one thing we haven't talked about because you're asking me what the things that I've been doing or interested in, is the whole sort of environmental, ecological, which has been hijacked by the term sort of climate area, which I have been fundamentally interested in as much as I'm interested in natural health. And there I find that if you try and explain something in the digital realm, it's very, very difficult. But I found when I actually talk to people, I can see that they are suddenly getting, and probably because of the way I'm talking about it, they're suddenly getting that it may not be as simple as they believed it was. And generally because also the arguments I make are not what they expect, because there's this, the media creates the straw man.
Sure.
So the straw man of the sort of climate denier, which is based on the simple position of, no, the climate is not getting warmer. And so that's what the straw man is like. And then when instead they interact with people who have maybe taken time to look at it and think through it and study it carefully, that's very rarely what the position is. And for me, one of the things I find most interesting is the one about the sun not being static. And not being static not only because the whole solar system is sort of traveling at an incredible speed across the universe, but it's not static in relation to the planets, that it's actually moving.
Right.
Because I find that most people don't know that. And they've been used to the only thing most people would be exposed to about the solar system is what they've been taught at school.
Sure.
And at primary school, generally. And that's a huge simplification, static sun and perfect orbit, circular orbit of the planets around it. And if people who looked at it slightly further will be aware that the orbits instead are, especially, well, let's say the Earth, but most orbits are instead not regular, they're elliptical. Then there are sort of axis tilts, so the orbit is not in relation to the tilts. And so people who looked at it more will know about that. But then much fewer are actually aware that the sun is moving in a spiral-like way in relation to the planets. And so that's something that I like to talk about, because I think that maybe because it's an area that I like, but I think I find it interesting because it sort of already goes against what people assume. So there's a level of assumptions. You say, well, what do you actually know? And what does that mean? That means that there is a constantly varying distance between the Earth and the Sun for that reason alone, let alone all the other ones. And then I start to sort of talk about the fact that if you look at tree rings, most people think that the people who will be skeptical will not, will sort of hate trees or things like that. And so instead, so you start talking about trees, and you say, well, if you look at tree rings going back like thousands of years, you find that every 11 years they are bigger in the sense that the tree grows more, and it's gradual. So they peak after 11 years and then they become smaller. So there's something to do with the effect of most probably the sun on that tree every 11 years. And so you start to say, well, we've got a memory of that in nature. So it's not just a graph that's made by someone that you could then say, but they're paid by the, kind of oil industry. And so you start to get into that. And then you say, well, but did you then know that the orbit of the biggest planet, Jupiter, around the sun is itself 11 years.
Okay.
So you start to say, okay, well, that's interesting. 11 years solar cycle registered by trees. Then there's an 11-year orbit of the sun. It says, so what could be the link? Well, being the biggest planet, it's the one that has the biggest effect on the sun itself.
Okay, yeah.
And if you think that, if you think about you say, oh, but the sun is much bigger. Okay, but if you think about the Earth and the moon is much smaller, but it still has a gravitational pull which is strong enough to move the oceans a few meters here and there.
Yeah.
And so that's on the ocean. And if you imagine that the effect of Jupiter on the sun not only moves it by about like 2 or 3 times the sun's own diameter. So it moves it within itself a distance which is bigger than itself, let's put it that way. And that's what we measure in a way with the available tools we have. But then we do something that is almost very difficult to measure apart from observing sunspots, is what effect does that have on the actual surface of the sun itself? And the sunspots tend to correspond with this 11-year cycle. So you say, well, there's a spot, what does the spot mean? Well, you could start to hypothesize that as the moon moves the oceans, Jupiter can move something on the surface of the sun enough for it to change or to bring more heat to the planet Earth at the time that the Jupiter is pulling towards planet Earth. It's pulling the sun towards planet Earth. And if you then look at the actual, you can see them online, but if you look at the real models of the solar system, there's one which is a real-time one, and you can see that the alignment of, when it gets hotter, the alignment is such that Jupiter and often the planets are all aligning in a particular direction, which means they're all pulling the sun in their direction. And generally to start to bring that into play also gives it a spatial, a more physical dimension that in a way the whole narrative of CO2 doesn't. CO2 is almost like the digital world of the environment. So you don't see it, you don't you don't engage with it. It's just sort of an abstraction. And in a world of digital abstractions, people find it easier to engage with a digital abstract. I don't have to think. I just have to. And then there's the whole groupthink and group consciousness. Then the whole thought process. Well, how can you be saying this when there are? And then there's all the sort of fraudulent notions of 97% of scientists say this or that. So how could they not have thought about this before? And that's basically a total, basically someone who's unaware of human psychology, especially when it comes to the Ash experiments. Do you know the Ash experiments?
Are they the conformity experiments?
Yeah, the conformity experience, yeah.
You get a subject, one subject who doesn't know and they say which line is longest.
Yeah, exactly.
Got to explain it a bit better because I haven't explained that well for people who don't know.
Well, that's when there was an experiment in which, let's say, there's 6 people in a room, 5 have been told to give a specific answer, even if it's not the true answer, and 1 hasn't been told anything, just been told to say the true answer to what he sees. And then the person conducting experiments will show them a series of, let's say, 5 lines, and then another one on the side and say which one matches that one. And the people who have been told to give the wrong answer all give the same wrong answer, and the person who's told say whatever you think gives the right answer, but it's only him. So he's quite puzzled when question 2 and question 3, the same thing happens again. He says something, and the other sort of 5 people all say something else. So by the time it gets to question 4 or question 5, he lets them answer first, so he doesn't take initiative anymore. and then basically the level of self-doubt has got to the stage where he thinks he's just not able to perceive things properly, and so he'll just say their answer. And that's sort of basic human psychology. So if you get into an environment, and I think that's what the whole COVID thing helped a lot to clarify, because you got to an environment where if you were an official scientist, then you had to say a particular narrative, and then if you were not, you could see from a mile away that that narrative was all made up. And then we discovered that there was money behind it, and we saw the same thing was happening in the environmental science, or so-called climate science, that you could only get into it, you could only get a job if you had a specific form of belief. And you wouldn't have a career or a job, couldn't pay your mortgage if you had a different type of belief. And therefore, of course, if you were a so-called climate scientist, you had to uphold an orthodoxy unless you were retired. Or there was a total, a trick that is often done is you get a particular scientist, a particular specific field, and you say that that represents everyone else. So the people who were excluded were the solar physicists. So you never hear a solar physicist interviewed when there's any conversation about the environment. They're this category that doesn't exist for the media. Because
is that what Corbyn is?
He was studying solar physics. So he would sort of have had a look at all of that as well. But like him, there's many more, and that's a whole category that was avoided, because they'd be the first people who would say, well, actually, there's a whole lot more going on here than a gas that doesn't exist.
So what about, you've talked about that conformity in terms of the science and the scientists, but what about us as people? Why is it that some people, in your opinion, are more susceptible to that toeing the line, and other people maybe less so? They're the ones who have been less taken in by the whole narrative and prepared to speak.
Part of it is, I think, what stage you were at when what may have questioned that happened. So what stage were you at of awareness of the mismatch between official narratives and possible true narratives? Were you at in 2020, let's say, or for whatever thing that you consider happened? That's part of it. And that's also linked with how much faith you had put in the structures that sort of in a way organize the system we're living in. And that's also dependent, again, like the scientist, is how much you're benefiting from it. You got into it for the right reasons. You got into medicine or climate science for the right reasons. One of them, you wanted to help people. The other one is you wanted to sort of understand the environment and make sure that things are done for the benefit of our collectively shared natural world. So you did it for the right reason. But then you've gone through university, which itself was a huge brainwashing operation, because the curriculum was created over a number of years by other people who were funded by special interests, and you didn't know that. And then you're sort of considered like, brilliant student, you're given maybe a grant to study something, and then you become a professor's assistant, and then you sort of start to become yourself a teacher. And you've all done that, pleasing that system that you got into, thinking you were doing good. So it takes quite a lot to, at some stage, think, oh my God, actually, maybe everything I've done was based on something which wasn't true. If you never had anything to do with that, it's probably easier. And then there's the projection of, your relationship to your parents, to government. So people
Yeah.
who tend to believe that, government or authority is like mommy and daddy, and
Yeah.
they just want to do what's good for you and maybe discipline you when you don't behave well. But ultimately, they've got your best interest at hand.
Yeah.
Which very often, with people who are raised by someone, very often that's the case. I mean, parents will always make mistakes, but very often there's the best interest of the children at hand. Not always, but often it's like that. And if you're brought up like that, you'll think that the world out there, people are trying their best.
Yeah.
At least in this country, because then you may think in other countries they're only run by dictators and only this one is democratic and all of that. So there's a few sort of narratives that reinforce both these things. And instead there's people who had different journeys and different shocks earlier down the line for different reasons, and basically identified that official narratives were far from objective and they're always sort of furthering certain agendas.
Yeah.
And so it depends at what stage you were at of all of that, and also with the relationship to doctors, because doctors became, I think in the scientific era, they became the new priests in some way. They became the person that would tell you, could give you eternal life. It basically would hand you things that would make you live longer, and that's why people who are older now, a lot of people are taking like countless amounts of pills, because the doctor has said that will make them live longer, and they'll believe it blindly.
Yeah.
So the doctor became this kind of face of science, and science replaced systems of belief, collective systems of belief like religion. And the doctor became this figure that was this benevolent figure, a little bit like almost a caricature of government. So this supposedly benevolent figure, and very often they are, but they're just unaware that they've been, as I said before, sort of the whole curriculum of medical school has effectively been created to further the sale of particular products. And they're not really aware of it, and it's very difficult for them to stand outside of it. And I've had, I don't know if you've tried that, but I've tried a number of these conversations with doctors who are maybe not really aware of my own position. And sometimes it can be very interesting, especially last time I was having a conversation with an Indian doctor, because I was saying certain things about traditional medicine. And I knew that they probably would have it in their own cultural experience of the world, and through Ayurveda and historic Indian medicine, and I managed to get an acknowledgement that there was a narrative and a belief that certain things would be helpful. But then it was quickly matched by, but there's no sort of scientific evidence of that. So it was a little bit of a laugh, a bit of sort of...
Yeah.
So there's these kind of two worlds that coexist. And so in a way, what stage were you at when this hit in 2020 on all those levels, on the level of medicine, the levels of belief in government, the levels of capture, corporate capture by all sorts of systems of authority. And now, after that, we kind of, I guess me first of all, but I think most of us who saw through, now we see it everywhere. So wherever you turn, I mean, I can't watch a film anymore without seeing what kind of, why it's been made, why was it given money. And very often it's because there's a kind of message that reinforces a bigger narrative that is being implemented for a further goal.
Yeah.
So I'm probably a complete bore to go to the.
I'm the same.
To go to the cinema with by someone, because ultimately say, what did you think? Well, I think they only did it because they were trying to see this, and I sort of maybe miss out a whole lot of other things that maybe are worthwhile in it because I just get annoyed at that dimension.
There's a sense that you don't want to. Well, for me, it's a sense that I don't want to surrender my subconscious to something that I don't trust. and as you trust less and less the media, it's harder to suspend your disbelief. That's the when you're watching a film, you have to surrender to it, don't you, to some extent, to enjoy it. A bit like life, you have to surrender to the game and believe it's true. In your subconscious, apparently, this is why you have to be very careful with children what they watch, because the subconscious actually can't differentiate between fiction and reality when it's watching a film.
Yeah, and also, I guess, having had the experience from the other angle, which is that the film that I was involved in producing was about, in a way, exactly that, exactly what happened, which, in a way, to give a slightly more, I guess, personal answer about where I was at when all the COVID thing happened, was that I had been working for 3 years on a film which rewinded the history of medicine back about 200 years to a point in which a holistic approach to healing started being replaced by a much more mechanistic, anatomical view of the body, which coincided with in a way, the form of the anatomical model in medicine reaching in a way its peak. Some almost perfect anatomical models were being made at that time.
Right.
Beautiful wax models.
Yeah.
But that also betrayed that by that stage, the body was seen like that. It was seen as sort of a machine, and that coincided with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And so one answer is that what happened. Yes, of course, authorities lied to us, but that could have happened, and we could all have said, sorry, we're not going there, like a lot of us did with, say, monkeypox. Mm-hmm. But people went there because they were, in a way, culturally pre-programmed to believe the narrative that health is about some mechanical particles that move in the air between a body and a body, and the body has no self-defenses, and if that reaches you, then you become terribly ill, and the only savior is some concocted liquid in a factory that's inserted beneath your skin via stainless steel cylinder that pierces you, and then the liquid comes inside. So it's totally absurd if you think about it, but we've been programmed to believe that things can be so mechanical.
Yeah.
Whereas 200 plus years ago, there was a totally different philosophy where everything was much more linked with everything else, and we were much more linked to nature, to other people, to our own sense of self, to our own dreams, because it wasn't Freud who invented the interpretation of dreams. He brought it back in the scientific age. But that was actually, we found out through looking at this doctor's history, that was actually part of the case studies.
When you say this doctor's history,
we based it on a doctor.
Yeah, do you want to say a little bit about the film and the actual story of the film?
Yeah, well, it was based on a, let's say, 18th century German doctor who left a huge body of work in terms of patient case studies, and a lot of analysis and drawings and interpretations, and historians of medicine have looked at it and thought that it was very interesting, because it revealed a practice that otherwise we wouldn't know, because our way of experiencing medicine is completely different. But we don't have anyone who can just step out of a time travel machine and say, well, actually, this is not how we did it 300 years ago. And all we know is the sort of bloodletting and the fact that certain powders were used in wounds, and they may or may not have worked at all. But we don't really know what else happened. And instead, through this case study, they realized that especially, I guess, maybe the female patients were more prone to go into a whole different dimension of explaining their dreams and in some cases, expectations and visions and the language that was shared, because they believed in the they called it sort of the humor, sort of the various type of mucus and liquid and earth and fire and things. And so these metaphors that were used were shared between doctor and patient, which created a bond, which is difficult to create when instead the doctor presents themselves as the knower of the scientific terminology and talks to the patient as the ignorant person who just needs to be told what to do. And so this, the writers of the film saw this as a very important stage and decided to create a script which was based about someone that has, in today's world, some doubts about their own direction as a sort of surgeon and someone working in, say, biotech and cancer, which was the main reason to work on these, let's say, lipid nanoparticles and mRNA and all of that. The original idea was if you could do that and reprogram cancer, then it's worth the risk.
Yeah.
And so we were working before that, we started in 2017 with someone who was possibly one of those people working in biotech. And then they themselves start to get an illness. And they realize that actually, as we said before, that their own being, let's say we could call it embodied soul, starts to tell them that actually there's a different path to healing yourself, which is actually based on that whole sense of belief in yourself first and foremost, that you can do it and that you don't need to relinquish it to a third party. And in that, let's say, crisis moment, the idea of this character is because she actually does, it comes to them a little bit like when we saw, let's say, Chris Whitty say certain things, and then it comes to you like he's lying, or Matt Hancock, and you sort of, he's lying, even if you haven't yourself studied all the evidence, you know that they're lying, because as a human being you can perceive another human being. And in the case of our character, she actually had a sort of what you could call them some kind of visions of a past history. And through these visions, she's led to this book of case studies, and she starts to study the past. And then she discovers that the relationship between the doctor and patient was a totally different thing, and it was potentially a very powerful healing element. And that's a little bit, that can happen a little bit in different forms of medicine, which are not based around, I'll look at whatever part of your body is hurting. I'll cross-check it with sort of a book or a notion I have in my head, and then I'll give you a product that you'll have to pay for, and that's the healing. And the whole world of metaphors, I mean, there was an interesting example of an Amazon tribe in which a woman had huge difficulty in giving birth, and the shaman was called up, and what the shaman did, he started to re-narrate their story of origin, which included a part of going out of a cave. And that metaphor, leading her through that metaphor, helped the childbirth.
Right.
So the idea that we had already in 2020 was extremely mechanistic. It wasn't based on the belief in narratives, the belief in the relationship between doctor and patient, the belief on self-healing, the belief on connecting, and in a way illness being some kind of crisis of connection, maybe with oneself, with one's body, with the choices of food, or with the choices of people you surround yourself with your doctor and things like that. It was just, all it is a mechanical thing that happens.
Yeah.
Defiance Records, bringing you the best music from the movement. Ramise's Never Give Up and Mad Mix's You're So Right, available now as a double A side on Defiance. And Raw Milk Conspiracy bringing purpose back to music with their latest single, This Is England 2024, and their brilliant debut, Misinformation Whore. Plus, now is a fantastic Ballad of a Toolmaker song from Trevor John. All available from Defiance Records, the Freedom label.
He did what he was told to do back then, and that's how he got in number 10.
And so the film in a way explored all this other dimension and opened up, and it was filmed in that way. It's very, very dreamy, very evocative of nature, of a different way of doing, of a different world perhaps that we kind of have left behind, where everything was connected and everybody was connected to each other in a much more aware way. And what I wanted to say with all of this was that what we witnessed was largely a public in which either people were ready to embrace it because they already had a notion that there was something wrong or something lost in the way that medicine was practiced today, or people who would maybe not get it at all, thinking, well, why are they looking back in the past? Why is this almost like, what's the point? What's the point? That was the question of someone at the first showing of the film.
Right.
At the Riverside Studios in London, and one person who obviously didn't really understand why we did it, who basically asked Charles Dance, what's the point?
Right.
At which Charles Dance did one of his best things that he always does as an actor, sort of slightly disapprovingly said, what's the point? What's the point?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we've got an issue here, and because he had
How do you answer that question?
he had become aware of it, and he sort of talked about the objectification of the body and the lack of time that a meeting with, let's say, an NHS GP can have. It can be extremely quick, it can be very objectifying, and there's no real relationship.
Yeah.
But obviously that person was never going to get it at this stage of their development anyway, or their understanding. Mm-hmm. And then the other part was the slight hostility or ignoring of the official, let's say, vehicles of cinema distribution that would basically be distributing films which have a lot less of a message than that one, and maybe are shot by in a very different way, and don't have that message, but they will get the distribution because when maybe you and I watch them, we'll see why, because they're furthering a particular narrative. Yeah. Whereas ours was doing the exact opposite. It was working against the narrative that was going to come out. So we got it shown at the first physical film festival after the lockdowns. But we were still in a world in which it was saying the opposite of what people wanted to hear still. People wanted to hear, you've done the best thing by saying yes to the so-called vaccine, you've been a good member of society, you were good by not going out for those lockdown periods. That's what everyone wanted to hear. The last thing that people wanted and still want to hear is you were conned by a big pharma and its corporate capture on government, and you allowed someone to inject yourself with the most toxic
Yeah.
so-called vaccine that was ever been done. Nobody wants to hear that. And so, asking certain questions is not received particularly well in a cultural environment, which is still very much owned by these interests. I mean, when you look at BlackRock, Vanguard being behind all of the same, pharmaceutical companies and food companies, which sort of create the illnesses, and then you go into natural health and you go into supermarket and it's sort of almost like trying to avoid seed oils. It seems like in itself looking at a needle in a haystack when you're in the supermarket now.
Yeah.
And obviously that's we now believe, at least I believe, that it's one reason for huge inflammations and illnesses. That obviously, if you're selling the poison and the medicine at the same time, and it's cheaper because it's the cheapest oil that was used. Again, in a way, it's a loop with the industrial era, because those oils were used for industrial machinery.
Yeah.
And they're much cheaper than olive oil or butter. And so they're put everywhere for that reason, and then they create that illness, and then there's the double profit, and then people are not strong enough to gain the power to become centered within themselves, because if you're always fighting off an illness, it's very difficult to be centered.
Yeah. What extent do you think that is a coordinated plan, or just a kind of evolutionary, it's something that's arisen just from sort of base human instincts of selfishness?
Do you remember maybe,
greed?
what was it, 15 years ago, maybe more, there was a film that was called The Corporation documentary film? Did you ever watch that one?
I think so.
So basically, it showed that the corporation is there for the profits of its shareholders.
Basically,
So it's never looking at what could be the benefit or harm of the end consumer. It's just looking at the share of the shareholder profit.
Yeah.
That's what it's there to do legally. And it does it more and more and more. There's no stopping it until, and I think that's maybe the only time you kind of maybe need an enlightened government that is able to regulate that. But otherwise, with a complete unregulation, it's only there to profit itself. And there may be people who are aware of it, but ultimately they're not going to do anything about it because they don't have any say in it. So whether it's whether someone sat down at a table and planned it, not necessarily. It's probably just the way that you create cheaper and cheaper food all the time. But there's probably an awareness somewhere that you don't want to change that because it's creating more ill people, and that may benefit you anyway. But the awareness is probably at the very, very top. And that's why, people who try and peddle artificial food, like Bill Gates, for example, and peddle sort of these vaccine narratives, he knows, right? I'm not sure everyone else in the supermarket knows, or even people in the factory know exactly what they're doing, but he knows. So someone at the top knows and is influencing it in that direction. The other thing is light. The building regulations are such that you're not allowed in a new build, or even if you're trying to get a regulation for even some kind of renovation, you're not allowed to put incandescent light bulbs anymore, halogen.
Is that right?
No, you have to go for low energy.
Yeah.
And so it's become almost illegal, but actually the only artificial light, apart from candlelight or flame light, that actually has beneficial effects are the halogen one. It's that form of light. the LEDs are not good for your health.
Sure.
The neons are not good for your health. So we come into a situation where you go into supermarket and almost everything has got something that's bad for you. Mainly seed oils, but also sugar. Or corn syrup, and then you go into environments in which it's regulated by building regulations that you are not allowed to put in the halogen lights because of this notion that you have to consume less energy, because of this notion that there's a link between CO2 and planetary temperature, which is extremely minor, probably almost negligible in reality. And so on the basis of some kind of flawed pseudoscience, there's a whole regulation. And that's the other thing about working in the architectural world and in the arts, especially in the sort of collective arts, where people tend to be, whether it's the tutors or the professors or the teachers tend to be Guardian readers. So they've got all their science from there, which is also funded by Bill Gates. So in the architectural world, it's almost impossible to talk to someone who hasn't been fully brainwashed with this issue of CO2 and with this issue of low energy. So to start a campaign and to try and tell people that actually the building regulations are all wrong because people's health is actually a quantifiable thing to some extent, because you can actually experience how you feel, and you could conduct experiments about that with different types of light. The idea of CO2 is instead it's a total abstraction. And in a system so complex as the solar system, it's totally impossible to prove that as exclusion of everything else is the real reason for any temperature variation. And although people claim it, it's impossible to prove that.
Yeah.
So you get into a world in which, in the arts, films are being made to promote certain narratives which on the surface seem caring of others, so particular minorities, particular movements of people from certain areas of the globe to others, and how that is a great thing, and it's very inhuman to say that should be stopped somehow, and there's disadvantages to that. So there's kind of, and then you tend to get this person who also wants to do good, and then has a sense that if you are someone like me who will be completely skeptical about the narrative of CO2, has a notion that democracy ultimately falls apart if there are no notions of controlled borders, and that's not because I hate other human beings, but that's because it's how it generally a democratic system has to work, which is that a certain group of people have to have enough shared things between them in order to cohesively vote for whichever thing that they believe in, and not vote against each other, but vote for whatever works. So that a certain group of people cannot be constantly changed, because also then it will question everything else that has been created. So it's not because of the hate of other humans, but it's purely for the management of the well-being of the people that are already there, really.
Sure.
And so then you get seen as someone who is against the whole system, and you get isolated, cancelled, and all of that. So it would be almost impossible to change these building regulations now. So it's a totally absurd situation where, by law, things are being done that actually harm people. But we've seen it through alleged vaccines as well, that they got very close to to doing that as well, with the idea, at least on the continent in Europe, they had sort of the green pass. So by law, you couldn't sit in a restaurant if you hadn't done something which would harm you. So they did use the law there as well. And now we're seeing it here with the so-called low energy lights. And we are surrounded by that. So ultimately, all you can say was, look, I don't expect everyone to agree, but we need to find a way in which we can all coexist, and people who completely disagree with these notions of what's legal, what light fitting is legal and what isn't, are able to also, be architects that specify building products and not be sort of excommunicated by the official church of the CO2 religion when you actually don't believe in that religion at all. It's almost impossible, I think, right now to do that. It's easier to do something else than to go along with it. And but then there's people like us who would probably, a lot of these things would probably have very similar understanding. And so you've got these two different worlds that are coexisting, which is this very strange situation, because you constantly have to shift in and out. I can be talking to you, but then I could be going to dinner with someone, or after this meeting, and then I'd have to really watch what I say, because I would sort of ruin it for everyone else.
Well,
for
that's
a start.
it. You have to choose your battles, don't you? There's no point just having conflict for the sake of conflict. It has to be constructive. That's not to mean one would censor oneself, but it has to be productive, and you are constantly aware of that, depending on how much interaction you have with so-called what people describe as normies. I don't like that term, but people who are perhaps less open to looking at stuff. If you have a lot of contact with those kind of people, then it can be very draining. Luckily, I don't have to have that much. But I know people
so you're quite lucky, because when you do regularly, it's always a very strange way of being, because you have to shift in and out. It's almost like you've got your sort of Superman cape, and then you've got to be Clark Kent for the next sort of few hours. So you have to change identity to some extent, and I'm not that good at doing that completely. So something will transpire, and then there's all these ready-made stock phrases that come out, which are very capable of getting on your nerves. Because they're almost designed to irritate you.
Yeah.
But you have to, in a way, decide, whether you ignore or whether you try and relate to them. So one of them that is the idea of, especially with the view of the sort of US elections, with the view of democracy. Let's say that there is a democratic system in which people actually do get to vote and get to choose their representative. And so this, we live in democracy, and we've always been a democracy, and to some extent there's some truth in that. But where I think that's not true is that we've never had a democratic information system before. Don't you think? Have we ever had it? We've always had.
The whole notion of democracy is an interesting concept, isn't it? Because to put it crudely, it could be classed as mob rule. So, go on.
I mean, that's fundamental, in the sense that it's certainly is not the be and end all of managing human beings. It's just one of the tools in the box. But the be and end all should actually be the protection of each and every one. In a world where we don't see people's lives as dispensable and to be utilized for the benefit of profit or other people's interests, everyone needs to be protected. So ultimately we get to this notion of what we established after the Second World War which is the human rights. Not that that is the be and end all again of everything, but at least it was a system in which you say there's something more important than democracy. And there's things more important than human rights as well, but that where we got to was, and that's what's happened in a way. One of the efforts of the digital age to rewrite everything was to make people forget that. And that's one of the things about, which in a way some irritates me about some of these, the fact that people think that everything is up for grabs. So if you have a debate at, let's say, the Oxford Union, Cambridge Union, or on the LBC radio, or on Piers Morgan or wherever, and someone wins the debate, then popular opinion says that that's the way things should be, and that's the way things are.
Yeah.
And that is almost designed to actually exclude people from looking at a body of work that's been agreed by countless amounts of people for specific reasons, that actually say that a lot of these things are not up for grabs. A lot of our rights are not up for grabs, and they're just there, and nobody can change them. And so yes, democracy is not the be and end all, it's just a tool, and actually human rights should trump democracy.
That's the American model, isn't it? Really, the sort of
constitutional.
But things aren't just up for grabs.
But in a way, how democracy in a system where information is not democratic is in itself entirely flawed. And since the invention of the printing press, where there was sort of replication of information, but the very few people had access to the printing press, and then when it became newspapers, very few people could actually own a newspaper. And so there was no democracy in information. Then it came to televisions, and television initially were only run by the state. Then you had private ones which were run for profit, but only sort of TV moguls would own. So we've never had it until sort of social media came along, and we are a little bit at that stage, and so now there's the whole algorithmic approach to bring us back to, again, a non-democratic form of information sphere. But to make it in a way that, once again, people don't realize. Because the thing is that, what, let's say, people like you and I would realize is that what we are being told is not the truth. And more regularly than not, if we're being told something, the first thing, we'll think, or I would think, is the truth is probably quite close to the opposite of this. Otherwise, we wouldn't be told this, because it would be going. The truth is always against their interest.
That can be a trap as well, can't it? I see people flip-flopping. Let's take the extreme example you were talking about, the solar system, and I always like to bring up the flat Earth thing. But there are people saying, well, because we're told the Earth is a globe, therefore it has to be flat. So everything is a lie, and then that's an extremely oversimplistic, quite a dangerous way to go, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Not uncommon though, and I think that's what that gets people trapped.
Yeah, you always have to have a critical sense about what you're being told, what the opposite position would be, and also the nuances and the details, and more often than not, it's actually not really like that. There's always an inkling of truth. So I don't really adhere to the notion that everything we are told is false. I adhere to the notion that there is a morsel of truth, which is then spun in a particular direction for a particular interest. Yeah. So that's how I generally see it.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
But it's the key of democracy is not necessarily about the process of the vote, but I think the key, especially right now, is about the control of the information platforms.
I noticed on Instagram so the American election was yesterday. This won't come out for a few weeks, but that's where we're at today. 2 days ago, I think, and I noticed that you said something like, "It's not about Trump. it's about the people who voted for him. And I really like that. I think because that's very similar to how I see it. I certainly don't, and I'm sure you don't believe in any kind of saviour who might be coming from the political world. But it does say something, and I can't help but be very relieved the way it went. Even though, you know, I have friends who would perhaps criticise me for falling for a false dichotomy and that Trump's just as bad. That might be the case, the person himself, but it certainly says something about where we're at, that people have rejected what was on offer, and that has to be a positive in my opinion.
Yeah, and you know, to bring it back to how I was sort of addressing it just now, if you look at some of the let's say some kind of people who have looked at positive or negative representations of, let's say, the two main presidential candidates, and they found something like that, you know, maybe 84%, or I'm just making numbers up now, but, you know, big number of portrayals of Trump in the corporate media and corporate news are entirely negative. Let's say, you know, 80+%, 85%. And then they would see then it was for Kamala Harris, and it was actually maybe 65% positive. So you'd see that in general, the corporate media was used to push people in a particular direction. And that hasn't worked. And I think that's a positive thing. So the critiques that you would get would be, oh, but Trump is a convicted felon, and Trump is not nice to women and is not nice to minorities, and he's just as much involved in the genocide, he's pro-Israel and all that, and to the point that he's closing his eyes and actually helping them doing what they so on. So that's the criticism that you will get. But the issue that I was focusing on at a time that people tend to fall into either celebrating Trump or sort of comparing him to Kamala Harris, the issue would be that actually it's what's a relief is that a system of information which wants the masses to do a particular thing is not effective. So it's not, the control is not working, which to some extent was the same here during the Brexit vote. And people may have had their own reasons for feeling strongly about either way for the Brexit vote. But I think a relief to a lot of people was that, you know, the media seemed to be very, very clearly in favor of Remain, the corporate media. But that didn't work, and that was a sense. So there's, in a way, the sense of relief that the control system doesn't work, and people are able to gain information independently of it. Whether the ultimate choice is right or wrong is a different issue. But they can gain information independently of it and make their own minds, which is how it should be. You know, how democracy should really work. It shouldn't be that there is a power system that gets people, herd them along in a particular direction. They just do it. And with the voting for Trump was, it was very much a rejection of what has been happening in the last few years, and also I think to some extent the hope, because when I talk to people who would be, if I talk to someone who's very supportive of, let's say, Kamala Harris, and would see everyone who supports Trump as sort of a mean, bad person, I mean, my way would be to say, well, actually, both people are hoping in a better direction, on what they consider a direction, but they're placing hope on one candidate or the other. They're placing hope for what they want to, what they think will be a better world. But both are doing the same thing. They're just placing their hope on different people for different reasons, different things. But ultimately, it's all about hope. And to deny that one side is able to express hope differently than the other is in a way trying to think for them. It's trying to judge and think for them.
Yeah.
And again, that's not the fact that the corporate media has done it all along does not mean that that's a correct way of doing it. That you are there to put yourself in a position. And in a way, I think what we do need to try and hold on to is a democratic system of information, or as democratic as possible, where people can be exposed. But ultimately, what that is actually people talking to each other.
Yeah.
Because that is the unfiltered, more democratic way of doing it. So, to meet physically in a group, you don't have any filter, and you just talk. And that can well, I say, I'd like to say it can never be stopped. Well, it was stopped during the lockdown. I mean, at least for people who abided to it, it was stopped. Yeah. And because ultimately that is democratic information sharing. If people were allowed to congregate as they would before and talk about it, I think probably people would have seen through it much more quickly, because there would be a few spoilsports, probably like you and I, who would have said, hold on a minute, this doesn't make any sense. And so there's an attempt to stop that. So the talking, and talking is important. And maybe that's why people like to watch podcasts, like to watch people talking to other people these days.
It's the most popular form of entertainment almost, isn't it? Reality TV and podcasts. And basically, people are interested in people. I mean, what else is there?
Yeah. Well, in my days,
essentially,
technologically, it used to be music.
Yeah.
And maybe when people still went to the cinema, maybe it was you go and watch a film or you listen to particular music, and that's what you consumed.
Yeah.
But now it's not really that anymore. I mean, you only hear the music if it comes to you through social media. And you'd probably be more interested in watching the musician talk than more often than not, than even listening to their new song. If you probably choose, people would probably choose, let me see what they have to say, more than let me listen to the song on repeat, which is what we did in my days. You just listened to the same album on repeat until you exhausted it. Yeah. So people now want to hear people talk. But even there, it's interesting how certain podcasters never get certain people on. So they're almost like, there's certain people that in a way we would probably need to hear from, but they'll never appear on Joe Rogan, or they'll never appear on Russell Brand, or I would say even on other ones, more local ones, that there's certain people that are.
Who would you put in that category?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily want to name names, but I would say there's certain topics, certain subjects. The Overton window is still very much controlled, even in those situations.
Okay.
And again, how would that happen? Is it that that you could, I guess how it would happen is that the person who is sitting on an extremely lucrative podcast is probably fearful that if they get someone who really says something that is considered cancelable, they may suffer.
Yeah.
And so they probably are always there at that limit. They're always operating at that limit of something which is controversial enough to be interesting, or different from the normie to be interesting, but not enough to be cancelable, so that you lose your podcast and you get demonetized. Yeah. So there's probably this kind of, in a way, these people who are the, let's say, Blade Runners, on that kind of level of always watching this thing and watching where it falls. Because ultimately the reality is that they can be demonetized from one day to the next from all the platforms. So it's not really free yet. maybe will never will be, none of it is still really free, because there's this fear.
I suppose in a sense that puts the ball in our court, so we have to be discerning and find information that we trust. And in a way, I think that's a good thing. I think too often we still, even those of us who might think of ourselves as truth seekers, we still often fall into this idea of looking for an authority to tell us what to do. And and I think that leads to this kind of insecurity and accusatory way of looking for shills and controlled opposition, and it's like a sort of paranoia. Whereas I think we have to let go a little bit of that, and perhaps not even worry too much about it, and just try and do our own homework. Of course, that depends on getting the information, but ultimately, what information do we need other than essentially we are sovereign? No one's going to tell us what to do. The facts can come and go, but the basic fundamentals are we need to protect our sovereignty, and that's what I always hang on to. And when I'm talking to people, it's okay, we can disagree about all kinds of things. You can think the earth is flat if you want. But what brings us together originally is this belief that, or this knowing that we are sovereign and that no one has the right to tell us what to do. No one has authority over us. And from there, we'll flesh out the rest.
Absolutely. And in some ways, I think we also need to relearn how to not agree on everything. And how that to not agree in an unemotional way. Because we also, everyone falls into it, and our side just as much as the other one falls into it. I mean, the amount of anger that you get, whichever way you see it, doesn't really matter ultimately. But if you say, like I would say, that I do believe that there was a unusual pathogen, which I would classify in the family of viruses, that got me, more than anyone else, because I talk about me and my own body, got me ill and my family across December 2019, January 2020.
Well, I'm going to have to ask you to leave, Robin.
Exactly. That's I would, it probably wouldn't be so quick. You'd probably say, oh, but how do you know that it's, that, and all sorts of a series of set questions to which I would answer my series of set answers, and then, but people can get very, very aggravated for their own reasons, and very angry. So I think we just need to relearn how to, and then then you get all of these internal wars and divisions and anger, and I think we do need to relearn how to basically disagree, which used to be, I remember it where it wasn't a problem.
I do fondly.
I'm old enough to remember where disagreement, even fundamental disagreement, wasn't a big deal. It didn't affect your friendship with someone. And we seem to be losing that on both sides, really.
I mean, that is a really interesting phenomenon, because I remember looking at conspiracy literature sort of 20 years ago and understanding then that they were trying to push this far right thing, and it was laughable to me at the time, but I could see it. And that's only just got stronger and stronger to the point where people are so scared, and I don't know how this has come about really. They're so scared of being labelled a certain way that they cannot tolerate difference of opinion. It's too frightening.
Okay, that's interesting. So what did you observe 20 years ago about the...
I just remember that specific... I remember reading a book, and I remember this... It was a kind of mainstream guy talking about conspiracy theories, and I was right in my 9/11 evangelical truther stage.
Okay.
So I was very... aware of the enemy's tactics. You know, I was hyper conscious of it and concerned that if we didn't win this battle, humanity would fail, and you know, all this kind of. That was my kind of mindset. It was quite a naive mindset, but well-meaning. And I just remember at that point being very concerned that we were being labelled far right, but I thought it was laughable, obviously. But that's only got stronger and stronger, where articles are being written on the psychology of conspiracy theorists, and that becomes part of the normal way for the majority of people to talk about us, critical thinkers. They've adopted these insults, and it's a quick way to dismiss what we're saying.
Yeah, I was just came across an article which was covering, I think it was an interview with David Gilmour, and by a guy from the Los Angeles Times. And at some stage he says to him, at a time in which, usual question, would you ever play with Roger Waters again? And then he says, oh no, because wouldn't play with a totalitarian supporting blah blah and things like that. And then he says, oh, at a time when other musicians of your generation became reactionary, and then he mentions sort of Roger Waters and Eric Clapton and Van Morrison, you've managed to hold on to it, or something like that. Mm-hmm. And he responds, yeah, I'm not like that. So they kind of, between themselves, they almost reinforce this false narrative, which is promoted on a sort of corporate news portal, which a lot of people will be exposed to. Yeah. And then they will get the perception that is truth. Yeah. And that you don't want to associate yourself with the people that these two people have by themselves, with no real evidence, no analysis, have decided to judge as reactionary or conspiracy theorists, if not far right. Yeah, I think they couldn't really use far right on Roger Waters, although they tried in Germany. So you get these things, and people who don't analyze things, which ultimately I think is really what it boils down to. You have a set of people who decided to look at evidence, think through it, really examine it, and make their own mind up. And then you have a group of people who are instead receiving their information secondhand, not looking at it, fearful of being categorized in any of those categories, who will just go along with it because they really want to belong. So fundamentally, it's an insecure state of being. Yeah. You really want to belong, you really need to belong, and so you go along with whatever narrative without questioning it, rather than questioning it. And if it means you don't belong anymore, you don't belong anymore, but at least you sort of made heads of tails of something. Yeah,
and I think it's worth bearing in mind that those drives are understandable. You know, we have to survive, and we have to. Yeah. We are social creatures, and I think just having a certain understanding for where people are coming from is really important. Not to get too wrapped up in the anger and the frustration of seeing something that other people don't see, but also understanding where they're coming from and why they are doing what they're doing and why they're saying what they're doing. We went to Kate Shimarani's talk the other night, and the subject of Mariana Spring came up, you know, the BBC journalist. And there was, it was almost like a pantomime, boo, like booing and hissing and anger, and Kate made the point, we need to understand where these people are coming from. That doesn't mean we accept what they're doing. It's just a question of understanding why these things are happening. And I think that's really important. And she had a sort of very sensitive sort of way of looking at it. And she'd invited her into her home, and she was looking at the person, she was dealing with the person, and she was saying how she saw that 24-year-old girl and what might be motivating her, and the trauma that she might have gone through, or the pressures that she might have gone through, that we just don't know, we just don't understand. And for me, that's one of the most important messages of this whole thing is having compassion and humanity and a certain level of forgiveness, and remembering that at some point we've all made stupid mistakes and we've all believed stupid beliefs, and we probably still are to some extent. You know, there's things that we'll probably change our minds on and look back on and say, oh, okay, got that wrong.
But when there's a machine that is set up in order to essentially sort of libel people, you know, ruin people's careers, or attempt to ruin their careers, or, you know, remove people from looking at them as sovereign beings and seeing them as labels.
Yeah.
And when it's dubious whether the person writing the article is doing it because they really believe it, because they really want to fit into a group, because they really want their job, because it pleases their editors, but they are participating in basically a sort of judgment of other human beings. I've got a bit of an issue with that. It's like when you decide to use your position to attack people who ultimately didn't do anything to you.
Yeah.
You know, I can attack someone who's trying to overstep my own sense of sovereignty. But if I'm just doing my own thing and expressing my own beliefs, and I'm not sort of overpowering you, or trying to overpower you, then if you step out and you sort of use your position to try and have a go at them, I think maybe it's much less worthy of empathy than when you meet someone who's just got a different idea for whatever reason, and you can empathize and you can say, well, actually, you know, I don't agree with them, but there's no point having a go at them because this and that. I think it's a bit more of a problem when people are being judged. I think I'm slightly allergic to people who jump on a high horse and judge others in a public platform when those others didn't necessarily do anything to them.
Sure.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm a little bit less tolerant about that.
I'm not even saying we should be tolerant. It's just a question of at least understanding the motivation. And I don't know, for me, I always try and see the humanity in underneath, you know, knowing what people are capable of, but also just keeping in mind that, in a sense, most people are trying to do the best that they can. Of course, people do things.
No, you're absolutely right, and it's important to remind oneself of this, especially when you get a bit aggravated. So it's important to always have this, in a way, to have this as a bit of something to hold in mind in these situations. And, you know, that between the choice, especially if you start from an insecure foundation, which may be related to trauma, whatever it is, the choice between not belonging, which is self-preservation, which means belonging, and not belonging, which means almost a death of the current self, can be so overwhelming that the choice for a particular person has to be belonging to a group of people who don't necessarily analyze things properly, because it's either that or a death of the self, which means a sort of fall into a sort of vertigo and kind of crisis, which you may just not be able to handle at that stage in your life, because that feeling, I mean, I remember that feeling after 9/11, the awareness that someone could, in cold blood, someone who wasn't motivated by terrorism from across the, from the Middle East, someone who was actually on the inside, could make the call that thousands of people would be killed. And I remember that feeling there, because I wasn't necessarily ready to see it then that it could be like that it could be so cold-blooded,
right?
Or if you want to use metaphors in a way, so reptilian. To be able to make such a calculation. And I remember that slight sense of vertigo when it was awareness. No, actually, that's exactly what it was, and you got to accept it, Robin. That there are people like that. And over time, I've just come to accept that the categorization of the human beings inside those buildings by the people who were making that call was basically categories of people who are not like me. Therefore, I don't empathize with them. And we're seeing it today in other areas of the world, where if people are not considered of your tribe or of your category, then they become dispensable for a very cold-blooded way of thinking. And I think the difficulty for let's say, that's when maybe I'm a sort of a normie, or like to see myself when it comes to empathy. The difference between someone who experiences empathy in a sort of normie way and someone who doesn't is the difficulty of conceiving of a psychopath. Conceiving of someone who will just do their own interest and will basically not even blink at thousands, if not with the so-called vaccines, potentially millions of people suffering, if not killed globally. And not blinking because it's to your own interest for whatever reason. And I think the difficulty there, and I still have that difficulty, is to actually conceive that we are surrounded. I don't know what percentage is it, 5% of people that are like that? Something like that?
Well, I've read
25.
Well, I've read more like 2%.
2%,
like the population clinically psychopathic.
And through that cold-blooded approach, you can rise to the top quite easily because you have no moral hurdles in doing certain things that the 98% will not do. So I find that still a little bit difficult to accept, but I remember that moment of acceptance, that's what it was, and that someone would just think like that, and that those were people who were in our so-called Western world and system. There were people at the very top who were like that. So it was much easier. It was much less of a shock to accept it during COVID because if you had accepted it at 9/11, you had gone through that psychological moment. The narrative is designed to make you not bridge that. It's designed to make you not want to talk, to not want to engage in dialogue with people like me and you. When you become the full-time activist, it's not good psychologically to be that, because your outlet becomes only in reaction to what you want to change. We are destroying the sort of hysteria about we are destroying the planet will implode and will be a ball of fire if we don't stop being human.
If you'd like to buy signed prints of any of the paintings from the series, you can go to jakefern.com or go to jakefern.co.uk to see my personal work. You can message me about the possibility of commissioning a portrait for yourself or a loved one. We also have Righteous Brothers work available in unlimited and limited edition prints. Perfect for anyone who wants the world to know what they think about what's going on.